My dear brothers and sisters, we are gathered here today not merely to reflect on words written in ancient scripture, but to confront a truth that echoes through the corridors of time, a truth that calls each of us to pause, to ponder, and to pray. For in the pages of the gospel, Jesus Christ, meek and merciful, yet bold and unafraid, once turned to a man and called him a fool. Now that's a mighty harsh word, my friends. Jesus, the Prince of Peace, the Good Shepherd, did not go around handing out insults lightly. No, when Jesus called a man a fool, he wasn't being petty or cruel. He was trying to shake a soul awake. He was sounding the alarm that still rings for us right here, right now. You see, Jesus wasn't condemning a man because he lacked money or power or status. No, Jesus was speaking to a man who had everything the world could offer, but had forgotten the one thing that truly mattered. He was rich in possessions, but poor in purpose. He had barns full of grain, but a heart empty of grace. And so the Son of God called him a fool, not because he was unintelligent, but because he was unwise, because he mistook success for significance, comfort for calling, and security for salvation. And I've come here tonight to ask, are we, too, building bigger barns while our souls grow smaller? Are we so busy counting our riches that we've forgotten to measure our righteousness? Have we become like that man, celebrated by the world, but called a fool by God? True wisdom is not measured by wealth, but by the values that guide our soul. That is the divine truth echoed through the pages of Scripture and the lessons of history. The world may honor the man who climbs the ladder of success, who accumulates property and prestige, who builds his empire and stretches his influence, but heaven looks deeper. Heaven does not applaud the one who has the most gold, but the one who carries the most grace. Heaven celebrates not the one who controls fortunes, but the one who serves with humility, who walks with justice, and who leads with love. We live in an age that often confuses abundance with wisdom. The headlines praise those who rise high, even if they trample others beneath their feet. The applause rings out for those who make headlines, even if their hearts are hollow. But there is a wisdom far higher than human intellect, far deeper than financial cunning. It is the wisdom that recognizes the sacred dignity of every human being, that refuses to sell the soul for silver, that dares to speak truth even when it's costly. True wisdom is not in counting coins, but in counting blessings, not in building monuments to self, but in lifting others toward hope. When Jesus looked upon that rich man who had stored up wealth for himself and said, "Thou fool," he wasn't attacking ambition. He wasn't condemning the desire to provide or to plan. No, Jesus was striking at a deeper error, the error of a life built entirely around self, a life so absorbed in gain that it forgot God, and in forgetting God, it forgot love. In forgetting love, it forgot justice. In forgetting justice, it forgot the very reason for its existence. That man had the means to feed the hungry, to clothe the poor, to heal the broken, to shine light into dark corners of the world. But he chose instead to hoard, to protect, to insulate his life with temporary comforts and call it success. That, my brothers and sisters, is the definition of a fool, not a man without intelligence, but a man without vision. A man whose moral compass is broken, who cannot see beyond the mirror, who cannot hear the cries of his fellow human beings over the clinking of his own coins. For what is wisdom if not the ability to live rightly? What is wisdom if not the courage to choose compassion over convenience, righteousness over recognition, sacrifice over selfishness? The wise do not ask, "What can I gain?" but rather, "Whom can I serve?" The wise are not the ones with the most answers, but the ones who ask the right questions. In every generation, there are those who shine with outward brilliance but are walking in inward darkness. There are those who hold titles, command industries, and rule over great domains, but whose names will be forgotten by heaven because their values never rose above the ground they walked on. But then there are those whose names will be whispered in eternity, not because they were rich in the world's eyes, but because they were rich in spirit, because their wisdom was anchored in truth, rooted in grace, and shaped by an unshakable love for God and humanity. True wisdom will always choose people over profit, purpose over power, eternity over the illusion of earthly success. A full barn and an empty heart is the tragedy of a misguided life. The man Jesus spoke of had prospered. His fields had yielded bountifully, his storehouses overflowed, and by all appearances he was a man who had made it. He stood tall in the eyes of the world, a symbol of success and hard work. But what he possessed in material riches, he lacked in spiritual depth. He had built bigger barns, but he had built no bridges to his fellow man. He had accumulated wealth, but he had not cultivated love. His soul, the very core of his being, had gone unnoticed, untouched, and unguarded. In the eyes of Jesus, this was not merely a mistake. It was a warning to all who would follow in the same footsteps. To live a life obsessed with accumulation while neglecting compassion is to wander blindly toward a tragic end. It is to place trust in things that rust, in treasures that fade, in security that is false. The barns may be full, but the heart is dry. The table may be laden, but the soul is starving. And that is the great contradiction. A man can be rich and yet completely bankrupt when it comes to the things that matter most. There is something deeply human about wanting to succeed, to provide, to create a future that feels safe. But when the pursuit of safety becomes an obsession, when the goal becomes more, always more, at the expense of generosity, then what is meant to bless begins to bind. The barns begin to cage the heart, and the possessions begin to possess the man. What good is it to have 1,000 grains of wheat if there is no hunger for justice, no thirst for righteousness, no bread shared with the hungry? What good is it to be called great by men, but forgotten by heaven? The man in Jesus' parable believed he had time. He believed he could finally sit back, eat, drink, and be merry, but he had prepared for every future except the one that truly mattered. He had made plans for his comfort, but none for his character. He had secured his property, but neglected his purpose. And in that oversight, he revealed the hollowness of a heart disconnected from God and deaf to the cries of humanity. Many walk the earth today with lives that mirror this story. They labor day and night, build businesses, climb ladders, and hoard wealth. They seek applause, recognition, and control, but they leave no legacy of kindness, no mark of mercy, no trail of compassion behind them. They are admired for their achievements, but forgotten for their humanity. Their barns rise tall, but their hearts grow cold. And still the voice of Christ echoes across time, not with condemnation, but with caution, calling us to examine not just the size of our harvest, but the state of our hearts. Jesus called him a fool, not for what he had, but for what he lacked within. The world saw a man who was successful, prosperous, and powerful. He had wealth stored up, his barns were overflowing, and his plans were perfectly aligned for a future of ease and luxury. He could sit back, recline in comfort, and tell his soul to rest. But Jesus, who sees not just the surface but the soul, looked beyond the riches and saw the emptiness. He saw a man rich in things but poor in meaning, rich in resources but bankrupt in righteousness. And so he called him a fool, not because he was uneducated or unintelligent, but because he failed to recognize the most important investment of all, the investment in the eternal. There is a difference between having and being. This man had much, but he had become very little. He had possessions, but no purpose. He had control over his property, but none over his priorities. He knew how to multiply grain, but not how to multiply grace. He understood the marketplace, but not mercy. He had mastered business, but not brokenness. And it is here that Jesus challenges every one of us, not to condemn success, but to confront the silence of the soul that can often lie behind it. Jesus' words remind us that having everything and being nothing is a danger too many never see coming. The problem was not that he planned ahead. It was that he planned without God. He looked to the future but failed to look upward. He consulted himself, saying, "Soul, you have many goods laid up." But he never consulted the one who gave him breath. He spoke to his own comfort, but never to the cries of the poor. He built for himself, but never gave to others. His life was filled with motion, but it lacked meaning. He confused the temporal for the eternal, the urgent for the important, and in doing so, made the most costly mistake a soul can make. There are many people today who are praised, promoted, and envied for what they have, but who are slowly dying inside from what they lack. They drive expensive cars, live in spacious homes, wear fine clothes, but are haunted by an absence of peace. They go to bed with bank accounts full and hearts empty. Their lives are measured in digits, but not in depth. Jesus' words cut through the illusion and call us back to what truly matters, not the number of things we accumulate, but the condition of the spirit we carry within. To be called a fool by Jesus is not a matter of failure in the eyes of man, but blindness to the values of heaven. It is not about ignorance of the world's ways, but ignorance of God's will. The man Jesus called a fool was not guilty of crime or cruelty. He was guilty of neglect. Neglect of his soul, his neighbor, his calling, and his Creator. He made the fatal mistake of preparing for every tomorrow but the one that brings us face to face with eternity. When purpose is replaced by possession, the spirit begins to starve. There is a quiet tragedy in the life that looks successful on the surface, but is aimless at its core. The man Jesus spoke of had everything a person could want: land, crops, barns, and a future that seemed bright and secure. He was a master of gathering, a planner of storage, a champion of surplus. Yet with all that he had, there was something missing. His possessions were growing, but his purpose was shrinking. He was so busy building up things that he forgot to build up his soul. And in that forgetfulness, he lost sight of the reason he was alive in the first place. There is something deeply dangerous about allowing things to define us. When we begin to measure our value by what we own rather than who we are, we step onto a path that leads us away from fulfillment and closer to spiritual famine. The man in the parable had so many things, but none of those things could feed the hunger of the heart. He had goods for his body, but no grace for his soul. He had a vision for wealth, but no vision for why he existed beyond the wealth. And that is what makes Jesus' words so powerful, because they peel back the illusion and reveal the truth. A life filled with stuff can still be painfully empty. Purpose gives direction to our days, meaning to our work, and strength to our suffering. Possession on its own cannot do that. Possessions are tools. They are not the reason we live. But when we reverse the order, when we make the tool into the treasure and the means into the end, we create a life that looks full but feels hollow. The barns get bigger, but the questions get louder. Why am I here? Who am I helping? What will my life mean when I am gone? And if those questions are left unanswered, the soul begins to ache in places no luxury can soothe. Jesus was not warning against having possessions. He was warning against being possessed by them. He saw the danger in a life where comfort replaces calling, where abundance masks aimlessness, where a man can be surrounded by riches yet starving for a reason to wake up in the morning. This man had made himself the center of his universe. He spoke to his own soul as if it were separate from the needs of others, but true purpose always pulls us outward, toward love, toward service, toward impact. There are countless individuals today who feel a deep inner void despite having achieved outward success. They chase after more, thinking it will satisfy, but find only fleeting relief. Their calendars are full, but their hearts are restless. They own more than their grandparents ever dreamed of, yet feel less joy than they did. The danger is not in abundance, but in forgetting why we were given what we have. Purpose is the compass of the Spirit, and when it is lost, even the most luxurious life can become a wilderness. A man becomes a fool when he forgets eternity in pursuit of the temporary. The parable Jesus shared was not just about a rich man. It was about every person who becomes so consumed with today that they lose sight of forever. That man had fields that yielded abundantly, and instead of lifting his eyes to heaven in gratitude, he looked inward with self-satisfaction. He said to himself, "Soul, take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." He believed that because his barns were full, his soul was secure. But in that very moment, the eternal voice of God broke through his illusion and declared him a fool, not because he was wealthy, but because he had forgotten the only future that truly mattered. This world is full of glittering distractions. We are surrounded by flashing signs that tell us to live for now, to chase the next thrill, the next dollar, the next reward. We are told to work harder, buy bigger, and show off louder. But in that chase, many forget that life is a vapor, a breath, a mist that appears for a moment and then vanishes. What good is it to gain the whole world and lose your soul? What good is it to have every comfort on earth and find yourself unprepared for heaven? The man in the parable had plans for the days ahead, but he never asked what his life meant in the light of eternity. He had goals, but no godliness. He had timelines, but no timeless truth. He lived as if the present was permanent, as if the here and now was all there would ever be. And that, Jesus warns us, is the road to foolishness. It is not foolish to work hard. It is not foolish to succeed. But it is foolish to believe that what we build here can replace what we must answer for there. There is a deep wisdom in living with eternity in view. It transforms how we spend our time, how we love others, how we forgive, and how we give. It reminds us that our days are numbered, and therefore each one is sacred. When we remember eternity, we stop wasting energy on things that fade, and we start investing in things that last. We become generous not just with money, but with kindness. We choose integrity over image and purpose over pleasure. We build our lives not on sand, but on the rock of something greater than ourselves. The man Jesus described had a full schedule but an empty spirit. He thought he had more time, but time was never promised. He thought his soul was his own to comfort, but it was on loan from the Creator, and in forgetting that truth, he wandered into the most dangerous delusion of all, that this life is ultimate, that this world is final. The truth is, eternity is written on the human heart. We are not just bodies that breathe, we are souls that yearn. And when we bury that yearning beneath piles of possessions or plans, we risk missing the very reason we were created. God is not impressed by the size of your bank account, but by the depth of your compassion. When Jesus told the parable of the rich fool, he wasn't taking issue with success or prosperity in themselves. He was pointing to a deeper failure, a failure of the heart. The man had accumulated more than enough, yet his wealth had done nothing to soften his spirit, awaken his empathy, or move him toward generosity. He was rich in material things, but poor in mercy. He built bigger barns, but not a bigger heart. And in the eyes of heaven, that is the true measure of foolishness. This world often teaches us to admire those who achieve, who accumulate, who rise to the top of every field. We are taught to chase profits, polish resumes, build empires. But the kingdom of God sees differently. It does not measure greatness by wealth, but by willingness to serve. It does not celebrate hoarding, but healing. God is not moved by what we have, but by what we give, not just from our wallets, but from our souls. Compassion is the currency of heaven, and it cannot be bought, only offered freely from a loving heart. In the story, the man's mistake was not that he had been blessed. It was that he failed to let his blessings bless others. He saw his abundance as a reason to rest, not a responsibility to reach. He congratulated himself on his fortune, but never once looked beyond his fence to see who was in need. His grain piled high while stomachs in nearby villages rumbled. His barns expanded, but his vision remained small, and so Jesus draws a sharp contrast. What the world applauds, God may grieve. What we think is success may be, in divine eyes, a squandered opportunity to love. True compassion is not passive, it is not a feeling, it is an action, a choice, a way of life. It sees the suffering of others and refuses to look away. It moves toward pain, not around it. It listens to the unheard and lifts up the unseen. Compassion is not just about giving what we have. It is about sharing who we are. It requires us to slow down, to feel deeply, to be present with the brokenness of this world. It is in the feeding of the hungry, the welcoming of the stranger, the defending of the vulnerable that we become rich in the eyes of God. There are countless individuals who may never be featured in headlines or earn fortunes, but whose lives overflow with compassion. They are the silent heroes, the gentle hands, the kind voices in the storm. Their riches are not counted in dollars, but in lives touched, burdens lifted, and hope restored. And when the final pages of our lives are turned, when the applause fades and the accolades are forgotten, it is not our status or savings that will matter, but whether we loved well, whether we gave fully, whether we carried compassion like a flame in a darkened world. That is what God remembers, that is what heaven honors, that is what truly lasts.